Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chat. Thanks again for joining me. I hope you had a great week. This weekend, this topic this week comes from an event that's happening this weekend. A lot of folks look forward to the last full weekend of July, which has traditionally been racing and reunion weekend. It started off as a celebration of our horse racing history. Then it became a heritage weekend, sort of an old home week. And part of that was reunion weekend, where there's an all-class party, and then each of the classes celebrating milestone reunions tend to have their reunions all on that same weekend. So it's a nice big weekend here in East Aurora. And I had a few topics in mind, but one of them seemed to come up more often than the others. So I'm going to save the other school-related, reunion-related topics for later. But the school yearbook, the high school yearbook, is a topic that has come up because I worked on a exhibit. We have a featured exhibit that is temporary in the municipal center outside the historian's office. The historian's office collaborates with the Aurora Historical Society to display the history of the community, and every couple months we change out what we call a featured exhibit. A lot of things that we have in the collection are sitting on shelves or in storage boxes, and we feel that it's great to bring it out so the community, that it's your collection, it's your history, can see it. And one of the things that I've been meaning to do for a while, the volunteers and I, is we have a very large collection of high school yearbooks that have been donated to the archives over the years, and they're a great historical resource. So one of the ideas I had, and we've been putting together for a while, and it's now on exhibit in the outside the historian's office at the municipal center on Oakwood Avenue, is an exhibit of the yearbooks, or at least as many as we could fit from the collection that we have. And we are missing some, but we rely on donations. So in the collection are yearbooks dating back to the 1800s, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So the idea was that we would just display these yearbooks, and that would just be enough of a conversation piece. People would come up, see their yearbook, see the differences in styles over the years, just sort of kind of bring back some nostalgia. And I wasn't going to really label them. I was just going to put them in order and leave it at that. But as I delved into it, which tends to happen, I started to do a little bit more research about the East Aurora High School yearbook, but also just yearbooks in general. Like, how did this tradition get started? Why do we sign a yearbook at the end of each year? And how long has East Aurora had one? And I bit off a little more than I could chew, and to be honest, but I followed up the exhibit, which you can go see through September 8th. Throughout the summer, we have it on exhibit. And I'll share some of the links in the comments, some of the photographs from that exhibit. But I encourage you to go actually see it in the municipal center. As I was discovering, when one of the questions that came up was, when was the first East Aurora High School yearbook? And that question it doesn't really have a specific answer. And what we discovered is that the yearbook started off as a school catalog. And it actually goes back to the mid-1880s when we first had a public high school. So a yearbook goes back, or a catalog was published for the public school right from the beginning. But it also was published well before that, too, when we had the private school, the Aurora Academy, and we have copies of those in the collection as well. For space reasons, I just stuck to the public school part of it. But to answer the question about when a publication was published, a yearbook with student names in it, that goes back to the beginning of the East Aurora Union School District. But it really, you could consider that the first yearbook, but not. It does not resemble the yearbooks that we have today. So it was called the School Catalog, and it was published at the beginning of the year, and it had the names of the students. And the courses that were offered, some of the extracurricular activities. that catalog was published for many, many years. And in fact, they changed the title of it in 1903 to the Yearbook. And as we were going through, I was like, oh, this is the first yearbook. And as we were looking and I looked closer at it, it's just a catalog. They just put the name Yearbook on it. Still published at the beginning of the year. So we really couldn't consider that one a yearbook. Around 1912, the high school had started publishing a magazine, a monthly magazine, and it was published each month. But the June issue was devoted somewhere a little bit after 1912. We don't necessarily have that first issue. We have a lot of issues of that high school magazine in the archives. But it was called The Optimist, and the June issue was dedicated to the senior class. Similarly to a yearbook, had lists of the students' names. It had extracurricular activities. It even had like little mottos under the students' names or their favorite activities, that sort of thing that you would see in a yearbook. The thing that was missing were portraits. There were no pictures of the students in these the senior issue. They called it the senior number in June of the student magazine. Well, that kept getting published. So it was The Optimist was published in beginning in 1912 and went into the early 1920s, and it was at the end of June. 1923 comes along, and we noticed as we were putting the exhibit together and as I was doing more research that was probably, if I were to answer the question of when was the first high school yearbook published in East Aurora, it would have been 1923. And it was still the June issue of The Optimist, of the student magazine. But the reason I say that is because it's the first issue that actually looked like what we think of a high school yearbook today. And it had senior portraits in it. It was the first one with senior portraits. It was the first one with a dedication. They dedicated it to the assistant principal, Miss Reed. And so it just was the first one that really had resembled a modern yearbook. So if I were to have to answer the question of when did East Aurora publish its first high school yearbook, it would have been in 1923. It was not called the Auroran. Actually, that came by another decade or so later, actually more than that. They had a couple different, the magazine went out, and they had a couple of publications. They named them Borealis one year, Aurora Borealis, so the name of the formal yearbook that they put out in the late 1920s, early 1930s, Borealis, and then the one year they just called it the Senior Annual. Well, they weren't published every year, so we don't have a yearbook for every year. And it seems like my research into the East Aurora Advertiser actually just did a search for a yearbook to see what would come up. And that's how I kind of put together all this history about the high school yearbook. And it seemed like every few years there'd be a couple years they didn't do a yearbook, and then the next year the students wanted to have one, so they would have a fundraiser and put a committee together to do the yearbook. And 1936 was actually a year they really wanted to do it up. And they created a committee, and they actually got a contract, or went to the Roycroft shops to have it printed. So it's a really fancy yearbook, and I'll post a link in the comments. But this was there's a little note in the East Aurora Advertiser that said the yearbook is coming along, and the name has been selected. But they didn't publicize the name at that point. They kind of kept it a secret. So that tells us that the ultimate name of the yearbook was the Auroran, and it was published in 1936, that was the name that it has had, one would think, ever since. Well, 1939 comes along, and we have a yearbook that does not resemble the 1936 version. The 1936 version is very fancy, hardcover. 1939 is paperback, much smaller. And the title of it is Past Perfect, and they didn't. There's no mention of the Auroran in that yearbook at all. We went through that yearbook with a fine-tooth comb to just see if the Auroran showed up. It does not. So the name was not an annual. The book was not called the same thing every year. It seems that through the 20s and 30s, late 20s and then the 30s, they would just pick a name each time they published it. It wasn't anything. It was not known as the Auroran. Uh, Starting in World War II, or 1941, 42, that is when the Auroran name is on the yearbook, and it has been on the yearbook ever since. So the first Auroran was published in 1936, but it hasn't been called Auroran technically since then. But the first yearbooks were not called Auroran, and so if you wanted to know when the first yearbook was, I would say 1923, which is interesting because when we first started doing this project for an exhibit, and I first started doing research into it, and of course the exhibit turns into research, which turns into an article I wrote for my monthly column in the Advertiser. I didn't mean for that to happen, but there was just so much information that I had uncovered. And of course my inquisitive mind started going, and so I wanted to know more. To answer the question of when was the first East Aurora High School yearbook, catalog at the beginning of time, beginning of the Union Free District. 1923 was the first one that had senior portraits in it, and the Auroran 1936, the first Auroran. So there are probably three different answers. 1923, and it's funny when I put together an article and do some research, and at some point you have to publish, and you have to publish it and get it out there. But I always find out more information after, it seems, and then I get upset kind of that I wasn't able to include it in the original article, and this was the case here. I just thought, well, 1923, why of 1923 did they all of a sudden start deciding that they wanted to have a yearbook with portraits in it? Well, it turns out if you just Google the history of yearbooks, there are articles in all sorts of reputable publications. I think The Atlantic was one of them, and some other historical publications on the history of yearbooks. And yearbooks have been published, actually, school scrapbooks were a thing for colleges. They didn't have photographs in them, but they would have information, and people would put dried flowers in there, sign their names, or write little things in there to their classmates. So that tradition's been going on for a very, very long time. And then the yearbooks seem like this weekend, people look at their yearbooks at reunions, right? You look back at it, and it's a great historical resource. It tells you who graduated, what sports were available at given time. We know when girls' sports started because they included them in the high school yearbook. East Aurora was very early in that. We had a girls' basketball team and a couple sports teams for girls. They didn't have any, I think they had one other team to play back at the beginning because not every school had girls' teams. But the yearbook shows you that, and that's why I'm talking about it this week in particular, is because at the reunion party you see a lot of people gather around the table with yearbooks and they're looking through. It's a great historical resource. But the reason 1923, 1920s and 1923 might have been picked as to why it was the first yearbook that I would consider a yearbook with portraits. Universities, like I said, had been having yearbooks. They used them as scrapbooks. And then military academies had yearbooks with portraits. Colleges started it. Well, high school started it in the 1920s because portraits, photography had come along to the point where they could, and publishing had come along to the point where they could publish yearbooks and photographs in those yearbooks. Newspapers were able to start publishing photographs. The technology was there. And actually companies got started, yearbook companies, who would help high schools format, and other schools format a yearbook. So you would take the portraits and then they would be submitted, there'd be a template, and they would publish the yearbook and make a lot of money off of it. Some of the early yearbooks in East Aurora were published by the East Aurora Advertiser. They had a publisher. They published not just the newspaper, but they did printing. And then the Roycroft was also a printer, so they printed. And then there were national companies that published yearbooks, and it was really just a cut and paste kind of thing, where the format was already there, and they would just insert the photographs, insert the names, so the format was already there. So it was fairly easy to publish a yearbook. So that might have been why, I'm guessing, that starting in 1923, the yearbook as we know it today began, because there was a market for it, and there was the technology there, and there were companies that were making it very easy to publish and helping high schools and high school student committees publish yearbooks. So that is probably why that started in 1923 here in East Aurora, and 1920s, early 1920s in other areas, because you could have photographs taken and included in a book and published, and so that it all comes down to technology. So 1923 being the first yearbook with portraits in it, or yearbook that we consider it in a modern sense, was not just an East Aurora thing. It was happening all over the country. And actually, that was something I learned after the fact. It dawned on me, like, why 1923? Was there something happening? And if you look in newspapers, they started publishing photographs at that time. So it was certainly a technology thing. So, so that's a little history of the East Aurora Yearbook, and some of the background into my research into it. I'm going to continue to do more, and I always, when I do finish an article, I always like to continue, and I find out more things. People respond to the articles, give me a little more feedback about it, and then I end up doing more research. So it's been a lot of fun. So as you're looking at the yearbooks this weekend at the reunion parties, you know, yeah, those are mostly Aurorans that we're looking at, but the yearbook actually dates back to, if you want to be very liberal with the definition of yearbook, goes back to the beginning of the Union School District in the 1880s. So kind of interesting. So I invite you to go to the Municipal Center to take a peek at the exhibit that we have there of all the high school yearbooks. We have a few more things that I haven't talked about today. And I'm going to put a link also to my monthly newspaper column that talks a little bit more about the history in more detail about the yearbook. But I wanted to just kind of chat today about how one thing led to another in my research, and that tends to happen, and probably with you too. And don't be afraid to delve into things. Go on some of those rabbit holes, because you might come up with some interesting information. So thanks again for joining me. Again, please leave a message. I'm getting some great feedback, some comments in the private messages, so feel free to do that. Give me some topic ideas. I love to chat about it, and I do welcome your feedback. So until next time, have a great week and enjoy reunion weekend. Even if you didn't graduate from East Aurora High School, you can still enjoy the activities around town. Talk to you soon. Thanks.